Greetings and welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the SEEP Network, and we are so pleased to have you here with us today and with this terrific panel to discuss the past and the future of the diaconate. We held a session a few months ago on deacons preaching, and it was so successful that we decided to put together what will be a series of 3 digital workshops, this being the first. And we've assembled a great crew to walk us through a wonderful conversation, and we are thrilled to have them with us. We look forward to your questions being entered in the chat, your comments being entered in the chat, and please don't be shy. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Carter. Carter, thank you so much for moderating, and I will drop off now. Thank you all.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I am Deacon Carter Hawley. I have worked for 30 years in state and local government in my secular world and nonprofit management. I served as canon for administration and archdeacon in the Diocese of Oregon and have recently relocated to Pittsburgh, where I am looking forward to serving the church in whatever way they need. Today, we have the great honor of hearing from 3 panelists to talk about the history of the diaconate and some of its more undiscussed components. They each have some important things to say, and if you have questions during their comments, you can put them in the chat and we will compile them and do all of the questions after the speakers have had their time. We will end at 4 o'clock, and if it turns out that we go a little after, that's okay too. So I will start with some introductions of the great panelists. We have Deacon Jerry Swanson, who was ordained to the diaconate in the Diocese of New York in 1997. She retired from a 30-year career in education as a teacher and staff developer in New York City. Her master's thesis focused on the history of the New York School for the Deaconesses and the ministry of its head mistress, Deaconess Susan Trevor Knapp. She currently sits on the board for the Fund for the Diaconate, and in her diocese, she serves on the Commission on Ministry and Advisory Council to Episcopal Charities. She lives in Staten Island and serves as a deacon there. Deacon Janet Tidwell was ordained to the diaconate in 2011, has served as archdeacon since 2014 in the Diocese of Atlanta. She's been an elementary school teacher, human resources manager, and deputy secretary of Wisconsin Department of Employment Relations. In the diocese, she serves on the Commission on Ministry, serves as a trainer for the Beloved Community in dismantling racism, as well as Called to Transformation, an asset-based community development program, and serves as a consultant for the Congregational Assessment Tool. She also serves as on the Human Resources Committee and History Committees for the Association for Episcopal Deacons. Finally, we've got Rod Dugliss, who after years of work in the mission field, college and university teaching and in administration, and the corporate world, has become the Dean of the School for Deacons in the Diocese of California more than 20 years ago. And he still is doing it. He lives in San Francisco, and we will start with Rod's blistering review of years and years of the diaconate. Rod?
Thanks, Carter. I have the assignment of packing about 2,000 years of history and theology of the diaconate into a short period of time for us all. So it's going to feel a little lickety-split, but it will touch on certainly the high points of the modern and postmodern renewal of the Sacred Order of Deacons in some of the Western churches and theological highlights that have emerged in that process. So this renewal begins quite specifically in the town of Kaiserwerth in Germany in the mid-19th century, where a Lutheran pastor, Theodor Fliedner, who was deeply disturbed by the human damage done by the Industrial Revolution, founded a house or community for the training and ministry of deacons, and more significantly, a house for the training and formation of deaconesses. This was quite a new and attention-getting move on his part. The movement grew and thrived for anybody trying to study for Jeopardy, a bit of trivia is this is where Florence Nightingale went to get her nursing training because it was considered déclassé for her to be a nurse in England. The idea of the deacons has migrated to the United Kingdom, where a community was founded, and separately to the US, and specifically to the Episcopal Church, through New York, and interestingly, Carter, in your new place, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Jerry and Janet are going to deal with all of that, so I'm going to kind of just let that be as it is and to move on. To describe the diaconate in the 19th century US for the Episcopal Church, Ormond Plater, in his book Many Servants, writes about 4 waves. The image of waves is helpful because waves overlap and they all move toward a common goal. So these waves are not so much chronological as they are contextual. And an underlying principle here, which is recognized often on to the present day, the diaconate always has a very local quality to it. It's always based in and informed by context, which is one of the issues of people's attempt to say, can we get just a nice single definition and a tidy one? You can do that around the priesthood, but not so much for deacons. The first of these waves was named for missionary and indigenous deacons. The Episcopal Church needed leadership on the growing edges of a country and the conquered native lands, and so looked for local folk to provide this leadership. Now, in those days, of course, Indians could not be ordained priests, but maybe it was okay for deacons. And there are some interesting stories of indigenous leaders in that role, as well as others who took the church out on the frontiers in a backpack. The second wave was the deaconesses, setting apart women to do some of the most challenging work at the margins geographically and socioeconomically of church and world. As I say, Jerry and Janet will talk to that. Wave 3 was a response to a momentary need in the post-World War II church, where returning veterans produced a blip that we've been celebrating ever since of rapidly increased membership. Overwhelmed rectors needed help. Well, we couldn't have lay people actually doing some of that stuff. Say, well, what about deacons? And so that proposal was put forward with the adjective perpetual. And that meant no sneaking through a back door to the priesthood. You were going to be a deacon in perpetuity. Very explicitly, they were to be men over 40, economically self-sufficient, which is where the idea of unpaid deacons has its roots, and briefly prepared. Approximately 530 men that we could document were so ordained, most of whom have now passed on, but served the church in many important ways, largely unnoticed. So an important kind of underlying thing that you may sense from the way I've stated this is the revival of the diaconate in the Episcopal Church up to really the end of this last century has been tainted in part by being used as a tool for systemic racism, misogyny, and keeping a bright line between lay men and ordination, that is, by which was meant the priesthood. That was, again, very contextual, but it contributes to a sense about the diaconate that still lurks in the corners. Captured in the prayer book of 1928, which was considered modern and 20th century in its day, where the diaconate is described as, quote, that inferior order. In the middle of the last century, there was a great deal of ferment in churches around a number of things, but particularly the diaconate. Our Roman Catholic friends in Vatican II did a major revisioning and revival of the diaconate for them. The work occurring largely in the American church, but not exclusively, led the Lambeth conferences over time to spend what the Episcopal Church or the wider Anglican community typically does, reports, committees, recommendations around the diaconate. Not a lot of accomplishment, but some foundation laid. The Episcopal Church at that time was also working on what was to be the new prayer book. It coincided, not with intention in a lot of quarters, with also the approving of ordination for women. So 7980 was a significant moment of change for the church. And for the diaconate, the roots theologically and otherwise were to be found in the new ordinal, where we define our orders. Overall, there's a tension which exists to this day, which is the focus on what deacons do, and between ecclesiology, or who are deacons. What is the place of deacons in our fundamental understanding of what it is to be church? The question of what do deacons do, as I think I hinted earlier, is because what deacons can be doing ranges widely depending on context, need, the church in its place, and when there's, for many people, when there are three or more things that are going on, they have this need to sort of say, but which one is the one? Theologically, there's a large sweep through the 2000 years from initially seeing the diaconate as embodying agape, that is the loving service. This evolves then into the voice for the voiceless, then on to a prophetic voice and prophetic action. For me, a keynote for that was around 2000 conference of worldwide diaconeo, whose motto was diaconia equals prophetic praxis. On the theological side, some landmarks. Part of that ferment in the mid-20th century was noticed and became part of the work of the World Council of Churches, particularly its Faith and Order Commission. In 1983, there was a major meeting in Lima, Peru, which produced a document entitled Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry. The World Council of Churches decided to take on those elements of the Christian life across various denominations and expressions that were both the most potentially uniting and the most potentially dividing. That is, what do we think about baptism? What is Eucharist and what does it mean? And ordained leadership. That latter portion affirmed that the three historic orders, bishop, priest, and deacon, were normative for Christianity. And that set loose a lot of exploring in many places around the world, but became a particular part of our defining within our own context. Again, the diaconate, as Barnett's book said, a full and equal order. Taking that particularly to heart, in 1995, there was a gathering of representatives from the Baltic Lutheran churches, which retained the three orders, the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, and the Lutheran Church in Germany, to talk through and try to come with a common theological understanding. Again, to be very simple, at the beginning, the foundation was laid. All ministry, the diaconate specifically, grows out of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It mentions Christ's diaconia on the cross and says the essence of church is three Greek words, liturgia, martyria, and diaconia. That is worship, witness, and active ministry in the world variously defined. Another kind of landmark, I could not be able to track down the specific year, but in Northfield, Minnesota, the Associated Parishes, an organization which were the drivers of liturgical renewal in the last century, and a newly formed North American Association for the Diaconate, held a conference to celebrate and affirm, first of all, that all ministry, all ordering is based on baptism. As restated, ministry is the total ministry of all the church, not a professional subset of it. We sacramentalize leadership to nurture, support, and energize all God's people. Soon thereafter, Ormond Plater wrote his still definitive book, Many Servants, first edition. Ormond was at Hanover, among other places. Our uniquely diaconal theologian, I guess. After that, a fellow named John Collins wrote a big fat book called Diaconia, and then a small one in English called Deacons in the Church, which revised and created the ground for a much fuller understanding of diaconia, from loving service to advocacy, articulation. Ormond then did a second edition of his book, incorporating the ideas that Collins had put forward. In 2003, in Stuttgart, Germany, post-Hanover, our Roman Catholic friends called together a conference on the theology of the diaconate, noticing what work had been done at Hanover, because they were getting pushed back against the outcomes of Vatican II and wanted to find a strong foundation for supporting their renewal of the diaconate. Came out of Tübingen, the great theological think tank in the Roman Catholic world, from the time of Karl Rahner, who articulated communion theology and the importance of the diaconate embedded in it. Communion theology says basically orders are embedded in community, relational, not top-down, not hierarchy. It's an example of what today theologians are naming as theology from below, like liberation theology. Continues to be a cutting edge well beyond Rome. In about the last 10 years, I didn't look up the date, Suzanne Watson-Epting's Unexpected Consequences, the Diaconate Renewed, has become a primary source with lots of documentation and carries the concept of waves into the present, which I think will be a focus of the next session of this series. In a post-COVID world, there's been a lot of ferment now around what could be emerging as the newest wave of the diaconate. Overall, the theology of the diaconate has not been systematic, but a collection of what I call strands that need to be woven into a whole. And there are many issues caught up in those strands. One fundamental theological one for the Episcopal Church, mid-20th century, Book of Common Prayer, which is our theology puts before us. That prayer book and that renewal was based on a Eucharistic ecclesiology and hermeneutic. When articulated, we then named a baptismal ecclesiology and hermeneutic. To put that in simpler words, a Eucharistic focus means we focus everything on the gathering around the altar, drawing inward. When we articulate a baptismal basis, we emphasize the moving out and the carrying of the good news into the world. We talk baptism, but we're still largely Eucharistic. Again, orders being seen as theologically not individual, but communal, relational. And I think I'll stop the deluge there. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Ron.
And I'm supposed to hand off to Jerry. Jerry, go for it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jerry Swanson from the Diocese of New York. And I want to talk about what the folks that were in that second wave of the diaconate in the country, and those are the deaconesses. They are the unsung heroines of this church. They're uncelebrated, and in some places they have been very much forgotten. So one of the things that I want to do is be able to talk about them so that people will be able to celebrate their lives. The first deaconesses were set apart in the United States in 1857 in Baltimore. There were about 6 of them, and I see Keith McCoy is joining us today. Keith has done some work around those women in Baltimore. One of them, her name was Catherine Menard. She began a nursing ministry in Baltimore with the support of Horace Stringfellow, who was the bishop there, and also the Bishop Whittingham of Maryland. She then set up the Sisterhood of the Good Shepherd in Baltimore Later, she returned to St. Louis, which was her hometown, where her dad was a priest, and she continued her ministry in nursing there. In 1864, in Alabama, the bishop there, Richard Wilmer, gave his support to an orphanage that was staffed by deaconesses. And the thing that made this very different than others is that they were not set apart. Well, they were set apart, but he also laid hands on them, which is very important. That's the first time we have a reference to laying on hands on deaconesses. So then the question becomes, is it ordination or is it setting apart? In 1867 in Philadelphia, the Bishop Potter Memorial House was established, and that's where the deaconesses were trained in Philadelphia. And I'll be talking about two of them later on in this talk. Also in Long Island, and when I look out my window here, I overlook the harbor and I can see the Diocese of Long Island, which is Brooklyn, from my window. And the Diocese of Long Island in 1872 appointed 7 women to serve as deaconesses in that diocese. They later became a group of a community of monastic nuns, so they didn't really last a very long time as deaconesses. Probably the most influential people who were celebrating the deaconesses were the Reverend William Reed Huntington, who was rector of Grace Church in New York City, and Mary Abbott Emery Twain, of the famous Emery sisters. She and her sister would go on to establish the Women's Auxiliary, which we now refer to as the ECW. They pushed for the passage of the Canon on Deaconesses, which happened at General Convention in 1889. So the Canon on Deaconesses was really interesting because it listed the qualifications needed by a woman to become a deaconess. She had to be unmarried. She had to be 25 years of old. She was required to have written references for entrance to the program. 14 references, 14 written references. 2 of them from priests. 6 of them could be women, but the others had to be for men. Now this was twice the number of written recommendations that a man going into the priesthood had to have at that same time. In addition to that, she had to prove that she was able to complete post-secondary education and understand that they would be subject to Episcopal oversight. Now, I will say this, that a lot of priests and men felt that this canon for the deaconesses made the deaconesses dependent on their bishop for oversight. In reality, deaconesses pretty much did what they wanted to do on their own with very little oversight. They had pretty much autonomy over whatever the ministries were. So the New York School for Deaconesses, the training house, was originally set in Grace Church. They were located on West 12th Street in 3 brownstones that the church owned, and that's where the original training program was. They, the academic program included the following. They had Old Testament, New Testament, church history, theology, and the art of teaching, Greek and ecclesiastical music. And that was the morning. And then in the afternoon, they had electives: sewing, ecclesiastical embroidery, nursing, bookkeeping, cooking, and laundry work. So there's a wide range of what they expected the deaconesses to do. They had summer workshops in hospitals or city ministries. And in 1891, the school became part of under the auspices of the Diocese of New York. The first graduating class was in 1892. In 1910, They moved to the close of the cathedral, and the building is still there. It's called St. Faith's House. It consisted of the oratory of the Good Shepherd. There was a library, a refectory. There were dormitory rooms for 50 students. Many of the faculty members were borrowed from the General Seminary in Lower Manhattan. And from 1890 through 1919, 284 women were admitted to the school, 169 graduated, and 95 became deaconesses. The school closed permanently in 1947. The building is still in use by the Diocese of New York. It's now called Diocesan House. The refectory is still used for meals. The oratory is still there. That's where the archives are. The library is still there. I was there. We recently did some work for the Commission on Ministries, and we interviewed candidates for the diaconate in the library that was the deaconess's library. And I think I might have been the only one who realized that is where we were. But the building is there, and the top floors are now apartments for bishops and visiting clergy. Most of the early deaconesses tended to stay in the domestic missionary field, working in places like Indian reservations, Alaska, urban settings, urban city settings, rural areas, mostly places where the male priest didn't want to go. Oftentimes the deaconess was the only person who was running the Sunday school and doing morning prayer and keeping the bookkeeping and doing the laundry and collecting the money and just staffing the whole place. After that, in the 1920s and onwards, there was kind of a shift, and most of the deaconesses were interested in overseas work, so they were in places like Hawaii, Taiwan, Japan, Japan and mainland China. And they were supported by their family, by their friends, and by the Women's Auxiliary, or as we know them as the ECW. They were big supporters of helping out these deaconesses. Many of them, especially overseas deaconesses, were very strong-willed and very, very independent. And one of them wrote to her bishop that in view of the trouble women missionaries make, if I were a bishop, I would not have one of them in my diocese, unless, of course, I wanted some work done, because they got the work done. Many parishes of my diocese, of the Diocese of New York, don't even know that they had deaconesses in their history. Two parishes I served out here on Staten Island, one of them had a young woman who was from their parish who went to the school. They didn't know. Another one had a deaconess serve at their parish for a couple of years. No one knew. There was no memory of these women, which is a shame. So what I want to share with you now is a couple of stories about deaconesses who attended either the New York School or the Philadelphia School. And I do want to shout out to Wayne, the archivist at Wayne Kempton, the archivist at the Diocese of New York. I met these women when I was doing my thesis at General Seminary. I decided to look into the deaconesses, and I went to the archives, and Wayne opened these boxes of books and all kinds of papers and yearbooks and alumni association newsletters. And I pulled out 4 or 5 of them when I opened them up, and I just pulled random names out of these books. And I met some fascinating women. So I just want to share a few of them with you. Bertha Garvin was a deaconess at Grace Church in New York City. She died in 1945. She was originally from New Hampshire. She served at Grace Church in Manhattan, where she was a rector's secretary and the vestry secretary for 40 years. She served under William Huntington, who had, of course, pioneered the deaconess cause of General Convention. She was active during World War I, and during that time, she organized Sunday dinners for sailors and soldiers who were passing through the busy port of New York on their way to Europe to fight in the war. At the 125th anniversary of the parish, she was honored at the Waldorf Astoria with a luncheon, and the guest speakers included Bishop Manning of New York, and more than 300 people attended. She also served as president of the Alumni Association of the New York Training School for Deaconesses in 1914, 1928, 29, and 30. And when she retired in 1940, she went back to New Hampshire, where she was born, and died on March 23rd of 45. Jessie Carroll Smith, an actress. She was a member of St. Bartholomew's in Manhattan. There were quite a few deaconesses who came out of St. Bartholomew's, but she was a very adventurous woman. She was made a deaconess at Holy Trinity Church in Paris, which is known as the American Pro Cathedral. She later served in Alaska and New York and Philadelphia. She died in 1923, but she led quite a life. She had been an actress, and at the age of 30, she went into the New York Training School for Deaconesses. She graduated in 2002, and in 1906 in Paris, she was set aside as a deaconess. While in Paris, she ran a small hospital, and during World War II, she served on the front lines in France at various field hospitals, including one that cared for wounded Senegalese soldiers serving the Third Army of France. It was a segregated unit. For her work on the front lines, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government. Nobody in St. Bart's even had any idea that this was happening to one of their members. In 1920, she came back to the States, went to Alaska, was up there as a missionary, came back to New York, ran the lunch club at St. Paul's Chapel, which is part of Trinity Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. And then she took a job at the Pro Cathedral in Philadelphia, where she taught church history. Unfortunately, in 1923, when she was vacationing on Long Island for the summer, she died unexpectedly, probably because of, she suffered a lot when she was in France during World War I. She developed a bad heart, and so it finally caught up to her. Anna Armstrong was a deaconess at St. Clement's in New York, which was close to my heart because I was also a deacon at St. Clement's in New York. She was born in 1873, died in 1960. She was set apart as a deaconess in 1908. She spent the majority of her time in the Diocese of New York. She served in various churches in the Bronx, settling in at St. Clement's for an 11-year term. And while she was there, she wrote plays, which is interesting because St. Clement's, if you ever come to New York City, it has the oldest off-Broadway theater in its sanctuary. She later on went up to Red Hook, where she retired to St. Clair's home and later St. Anne's Guest House. When she died at the age of 87, her funeral was held at Christ Church in Red Hook, and she was buried at St. John the Evangelist in Barrytown, along with several other deaconesses. I found her obituary in the New York Times. I called St. John the Evangelist in Barrytown. I was going to go up to lay some flowers at her grave. They told me they couldn't find her. They couldn't find her. They couldn't find the other deaconesses. They didn't know where they were buried. They claim they have no record. Interesting. And Annie Pugh. She was a deaconess from Philadelphia and St. Louis. She was born Hannah Pugh, grew up in Burlington, New Jersey, graduated from the Philadelphia School of Deaconesses in 1899, and was set apart by Bishop Whitaker of Pennsylvania. After 5 years working in Philadelphia, she went to St. Louis, and she was in charge of a new settlement house work there. She ran the Holy Cross home in St. Louis for 6 years. The house is currently known as Deacon Ann House and is used by the Episcopal Service Corps volunteers. Another deaconess, Jane Hall. She was a deacon in the Diocese of New York, but she was born in Philadelphia, and that's where she trained. She was also a deacon. She was also an actress. She arrived in New York at the age of 45 and remained here until her death. In New York, she served as a deaconess at the Church of the Transfiguration, known as the little church around the corner, where she developed her love of theater. She molded her life's ministry around the theater. In New York, she made her greatest contribution to women working in the theatrical fields when she established the 3 Arts Club, a place for struggling actresses to live while seeking work in the theater. Carol Burnett was one of the people who stayed at the old 3 Arts Club when she first got to New York. Additionally, she started the Professional Children's School for Child Actors, which is still in existence, and was a founding member of the Episcopal Actors Guild at Transfiguration. That is still around. And the guy who was in Law and Order, Ben, help me out here. Anyway, he was the president of it, as was Charlton Heston at one point. She died in Montclair, New Jersey, and is buried in Philadelphia. Susan Trevor Knapp, the most fascinating woman, deaconess and missionary to Japan. She was born in 1862, graduated from the New York Training School for Deaconesses in 1894. 1895, they asked her to come back, and she was a teacher there. In 1899, she was made a deaconess. In 1903, she was made dean of the school. She was a leader in both the American and worldwide deaconess movement. Because of a power struggle with the board of directors, she was on a world trip with a friend in 1916, and they stripped her of her role as a head mistress. When she came back, they offered her the job of head mother. In other words, she was in charge of the housekeeping. She said, no, thank you, got on a boat, went to Japan, and stayed there, surviving the 1923 earthquake, and left Japan in 1939 when they started to expel Europeans. She went to Los Angeles, and she died in November of 1941, a week before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So they are very interesting women. Let me just show you this. This is an icon that I had made of Susan Trevor Knapp that I gave for myself when I graduated with my MA thesis. My hope is that these women will be able to step up and take their place with the rest of the saints of God and be honored and respected by the church that they serve. Many of them retired to genteel poverty, and we can thank someone, even Susan Trevor Knapp, some of her estate went to the fund for the diaconate, or it was as known, it was a retirement fund for deaconesses, which is now the fund for the diaconate. So their legacy lives on in helping others. So Janet, stage is yours, it's all yours.
14 references, Jerry, really? I used to be an HR director. We didn't want 14 references for anybody. Amazing. And cause trouble. I thought that's what deacons are supposed to do. I call us all spoons because we are supposed to keep things stirred up. So I'm going to start with a quote, because a lot of people think that history is dull. You know, why do we even bother with it? It's dull. But one of my favorite poets, Maya Angelou, said, I have great respect for the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. I have respect for the past, but I'm a person of the moment. And that's why I'm here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some deaconesses in Georgia. I'm in the Diocese of Atlanta. There are two dioceses within Georgia. But I want to first start out with who I am. I was born and raised an Episcopalian. I didn't know anything about a deacon, period, let alone a deaconess, until maybe 1990. And I had no idea what deacons do. And I still think a lot of times people still don't know what we do, and we're not supposed to do it. We're supposed to be, we are. So this has been miraculous for me to hear the history of deacons, which I absolutely had no idea. After moving to Georgia in 2004, and I lived close to Macon, I learned about deaconesses, the Appleton deaconesses. Didn't know anything about them either. But there's a person there in Macon who knows a heck of a lot about it. And I was able to go to the church which she attends still, and I learned a lot about the Appleton deaconesses. In 1868, now we're talking about right after the Civil War, Bishop John Beckwith asked his friend, William Appleton, to build him a church, and also found an orphanage for daughters of Confederate soldiers. So Mr. Appleton, who was a person of means, did just that. And in 1870, the Appleton Church Home opened. Then he also had a friend, as Appleton asked a friend of his, Margaret Jennings, to help him with this because he couldn't do it by himself, but he asked a woman to help him get this orphanage and church built. Her name was Margaret Jennings. Jennings said, well, I can't do this all by myself. I'm going to get two more women. So a friend of hers, Jennings was from Louisiana, she got another friend of hers, Catherine Burt, to join her, and a third woman, Sarah Marks, to join together to run this orphanage. The Order of St. Catherine came about at a time that it was necessary for Appleton to have his daughter recognized. And his daughter was named Catherine. And so the Order of St. Catherine was officially dedicated in 1882. Now, it was the third order of deaconesses that was recognized in the Episcopal Church. Altogether, there were 9 deaconesses, 9 Appleton deaconesses. And the last one actually lived until 1967. So they were around for quite some time. The orphanage actually moved from what is now a part of St. Paul's Episcopal Church to a larger facility, a larger land area in Macon, still in Macon, where St. Francis Episcopal Church is. And Margaret Jennings, died as a result of nursing some of the girls during the measles epidemic. So, and she is buried, Jerry, she is buried, and 5 of the other deaconesses are actually buried in Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon. Every year, we recognize those 5 deaconesses that are buried, 5 of the 9 that are buried there with a service. There's a liturgy that has been developed just for those deaconesses. Some of the children that died at the orphanage are also buried there. So we haven't forgotten them. They are recognized. Also within St. Paul's, there is a window, a Tiffany window that was dedicated to the memory of Sister Catherine. So that Tiffany window is in existence. We recognize that every year during the formal recognition of the Appleton Deacons. There also is something that happened between, see, all of this at that time, all of this was the Diocese of Georgia. There was only one diocese. And then in 1907, it was split. The Diocese of Georgia was split into the Diocese of Georgia and the Diocese of Atlanta. And the Appleton home and orphanage fell in the area that is now the Diocese of Atlanta. So that's why we recognize her. In 1935, the orphanage itself closed, but the work continued, and it continues on today. I had an opportunity to meet one of the Appleton girls. She was an orphan, and she was at the orphanage. I knew Miss Betty pretty well, and she is now gone, but she said always was very proud of the fact that she was an Appleton girl and lived at the Appleton home. So, you know, it's not that we've forgotten them. Appleton Episcopal Ministries still exists, and it exists with a board of directors and has many, many outreach programs in the 10 churches, parishes that are a part of the Macon, what used to be Macon, it's now Middle Georgia Convocation. And all kinds of different programs are operated. Some of them, we have backpack ministries, we have domestic abuse shelters, after school programs, little free libraries, a diaper bank. All of this continues in the name of Appleton, and mostly designed, all of these ministries are mostly designed around children and families. So these deaconesses, the 9 of them, did not die in vain. They are still with us and still recognized very much by the church. Now, there is another deacon that I gotta tell you, I knew absolutely nothing about. And when I heard about this deacon, it just blew me away. In the Diocese of Georgia, there was a woman by the name of Anna Ellison Butler Alexander. And she was born at, well, 1865, at the end of the Civil War, to emancipated slaves. She was a phenomenal person. I guess I would call her an archetype of what a deacon is. She did it. She was an educator. She was the first and only African-American consecrated in the Episcopal Church. And that is something that I didn't know. A lot of people didn't know anything about her. She actually founded church away from where she lived. And the only way that she could get to those churches was by boat. And she took a boat every week and went to those churches. She founded a mission and a school for African Americans in Pinnock County, which is in rural Glenn, Georgia. The Church of the Good Shepherd in Pinnock. It taught generations of people and students, taught them African American predominantly, taught them reading and writing. And we're talking about a time that was not so far removed from the Civil War, where where we couldn't, we were not taught to read and write. And she got many of her students to the point that they could attend college and did attend college, some historically Black colleges in the South. So her alma mater, where she had been trained, it was called St. Paul Normal and Industrial School, which today still exists, and it became St. Paul's College in Lawrenceville, Virginia. In 1998, the Episcopal Church recognized Deaconess Alexander as a saint. And within the Diocese of Atlanta, she is recognized. In the Diocese of Atlanta, those 9 Appleton deaconesses are recognized as the first saints in the Diocese of Atlanta. So we have not forgotten these women, these courageous women, have not by any means. And, you know, I believe that the more knowledge we can get, the more we know about the past, we are able to earn more respect. And that's what I think deacons deacons are needed. We know we're needed. We want other people to know we're needed. And I think the diversity of deacons is extremely important going forward. We want deacons to look like the people that we serve. So I'm very happy to be a part of this conversation, and also tell you a little bit about the deaconesses, who are now, you know, really deacons, in the state of Georgia. So I'm going to hand this back over to Carter, who's on mute.
Those are going to be the words for 2020 and 2021. You're muted. Anyway, we clearly have a passion about deaconesses and history. And just a quick recap, what we've heard is that deacon ministry is contextual. There are waves of the diaconate that are not chronological. There's been revivals of the diaconate, which are actually, because of the way they were set up, dripping with systemic racism and problems that have embedded themselves into the order as we know it now. We've been a voice for the voiceless, a prophetic voice. There is not a systematic theology, but rather strands of theology. And then you get into the history of the deaconesses, who were largely not revered. Training and qualifications were very high, higher than in some cases the priests who they supported and couldn't be. They served where male priests didn't want to go. And one of the things that I found interesting about this conversation was that the theology, we've focused on the Eucharistic and baptismal theology. And as deacons, those are parts of the service that we're not as integrally involved with. And just thinking about these COVID times, how much we've talked about how are we going to get Eucharist to people in the building? And it feels a little bit like we haven't spent much time talking about how are we going to continue to do the agape ministry out in the world, so that the issue of Eucharistic and baptismal ministry is important and challenging. We've had a couple of questions that I will punt now. I think I posted one in the chat about the relationship between deacons and high and low church. We also got a question about Lutheran deacons. What's happening with Lutheran deacons since the revival started with the Lutherans? And I think Rod had an answer for that. Rod?
Very quickly, in the Lutheran Church, the deaconess movement continued and really sort of thrived and carried on, you know, well into the 21st century. The role of deacons sort of faded when we entered into a full communion agreement under the words of Call to Common Mission. One of the commitments was to revisit and restore the diaconate in the ELCA. And that work has been quietly going on, so that, and because of COVID, my date grasp gets a little fuzzy, but 3, 4, or 5 years ago, and in the General Synod, they recognized the diaconate specifically as a full and equal order, and are working now on an ordinal, a way of specifically setting folk aside. There's a lot of other history about why it happened that way, but that's the quick answer.
And then there was a question about what does it mean to be set apart? Do you mean ordained, or rather simply having a ministry blessed? And I believe Jerry had something to say about that.
Well, the canon on deaconesses indicated that they were to be set apart, but different bishops did different things. There was really no set steps to how this was supposed to happen. So we do have some bishops who laid hands on them. And there is a reference in an article in the New York Times of covering one of these service ceremonies for the early deaconesses, and the reporter used the word ordination. But I don't know, since I wasn't there to see the ceremony, I don't know how accurate that was, or if that was poetic license on the New York Times. All the news is fit to print supposedly, so we'll see.
And I would just like to also add that there are groups that are talking about the theology of the diaconate, and the challenge with that, as Rod mentioned, is that it's not a thing. There's not a single theology of the diaconate, and in part because it is so contextual. So as we're trying to figure out how to move forward, not only is it contextual to the community you live in, because deacons have a special relationship with their bishop, it's very contextual with the perspective of the bishop with whom you serve, or for whom you serve. So being a deacon in the Diocese of Pittsburgh may be very different than the Diocese of New York. So it's really difficult to have a conversation about theology historically, and moving forward, what we've got this challenge of is to try to figure out how do we talk about what deacons are and have it be an inclusive, we can't be all things. If you're all things to all people, if you stand for everything, sometimes you don't stand for anything. So there's got to be something that we are as deacons, and trying to figure out what that is in the midst of all of this contextual stuff is challenging and important work. And the following conversations are going to be talking about deacons today and deacons in the future. And as Janet started quoting Maya Angelou, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So we have given you a brief overview of everything. I think there are some questions. I think we've covered everything in the chat. If there are any remaining questions, feel free to put them in and we will save the chat. And I saw that Maureen Hagan mentioned that we can't save the links, so we will do our best to copy those and include them in the material that Joe is able to send out or save later. At that point, I'm happy to tell you that we are done at 4 o'clock in Eastern time. So thank you very much for coming. And yeah, so when are the next 2 sessions? Does anybody know? Somebody asked that question. November, I see. So stay tuned. Thank you very much for attending, and blessings on you all.